Well, on Wednesday, a judge criticised 9 protesters from the Black Lives Matter movement for disrupting up to 131 flights to London City Airport after they blockaded the runway for 6 hours. The 9 locked themselves together after storming the single runway on the East London Airport on September the 6th in the early hours of the morning, in a protest at what they said was the impact of climate change on black people around the world. So we decided to look at whether the climate change is in fact a race matter. So to discuss this is activist of Equality, Lee Jasper. He's on the line. We also have in the studio with us the Reverend Chike, who is the chair of the Rights and Equality Group in Newham, the borough in which the London City Airport actually is. And we have on Skype Asad, Rehman, who's the head of the International Climate Change at Friends of the Earth. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And of course, you can join the conversations throughout the show by tweeting your comments at Africa on IC or at the hashtag Africa This Week IC. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for coming. I'll start with the Reverend Doctor. What was your initial reaction on September the 6th when you heard that the morning traffic had been disrupted and that the airport was at a standstill because of a demonstration by Black Lives Matter? What was your reaction?
Well, when I saw the news, the first thing that I thought was I was actually happy. I felt that for some time it was important that black people are seen to show interest in the things that matter to everyone and not just the things that matter to only black people. So that was my initial reaction. But I have to say that as I got to read a little bit more about the movement itself, the Black Lives Matter here in Britain is slightly different from the one in the United States. I was slightly, I don't know how I felt, let me put it that way, when I saw that out of the 9 protesters, 8 of them were white and only 1 was black. It began to feel to me as if there is a kind of credibility gap. But I may say a little bit more about that as we go on.
Well, many would ask the question, what is wrong with that? I'm going to go and take an opinion from Lee Jasper on the line. Lee, what's your opinion when you first heard about the demonstration? What did you feel, given the fact that 9 of the demonstrators, only 1 of them was black?
I think 2 things. One, I think that initially a lot of people were confused about the action at London City Airport. I think there's 2 reasons for that. I think the environmental debate is not well developed as an issue in black and ethnic minority communities. And that's a shame because black and ethnic minority communities, particularly in London, suffer some of the poorest air quality in the capital. And of course, globally, we see the effects of climate change impacting on African, Caribbean, Asian, poor countries in the south that are suffering as a consequence of industrial development and the consequences for climate change in the north. I think the other thing is that the decision to use white activists, initially confusing, admittedly, even for me. But on closer inspection and understanding, what the tactic was is to use white bodies to put on that tarmac rather than black ones, because 7 black boys from Newham or Brixton would have been policed in an entirely different way. And I would say would also be treated by the courts in an entirely different way. You may be aware that the 9 individuals all got conditional discharges. I would dare to suggest, had they been black boys, that they would have suffered disproportionately at the hands of British criminal justice. So I think their tactic was right. I think the issue is a critical one, but I do think they've got to do a little bit more work on getting their communication and messaging right, and that's a mild criticism. The other point we have to say is this. They are 21, 22-year-olds. If you'd have come to me at 21 or 22 and asked me what campaigning I was doing, then you might not, I might be equally subject to the same sort of criticisms. They're a young movement, they're a developing movement, and by and large, I think the conditional discharge of the 9 white activists proved them right in terms of their tactics, and I think they've got to now build the issue of climate change and its impact amongst black and ethnic minority communities here in the UK, so there's greater sympathy, understanding and support for the cause.
Okay, Neef, thanks for that, those comments. Let me go to Rehman, our guest from the Friends of the Earth. What's your reaction to that? And in particular, what's the comments that Lee has made? And he seems to feel that in the end, all's well that ends well. And indeed, the action was correct in the way it was done. What's your feeling here?
Well, Assalamu alaikum, and
Alexa.
Were very supportive of Black Lives Matter in their action, I think on a number of different levels. And also, as a Newham resident, I was also very proud of the action. The reality, of course, is we must separate the two issues, because one, some people were confused about the tactic of using white allies to do the action. And I think the reality for people who live in Newham, and the reality of course, for much of the black community in the UK, is we know that the reaction of the security personnel at the airport would have been markedly different if young black people had been rowing across the docks. We have a recent experience here in Newham where two young brothers was shot in a bungled anti-terror raid. We have, of course, the experience of Jean-Charles de Menezes, who was killed at Stockwell Tube Station. So we know that the years of demonization of both the Muslim and the black community would have potentially necessitated a very different kind of reaction from the security forces at the airport. So it was done very much to protect and ensure that the response was very limited, and also to recognise that, of course, young black activists are increasingly disproportionately facing severe penalties if they take these kind of actions. And I think the reality of the decision by the courts to give people conditional discharges and the fine of £95, I think probably validates much of their concerns. But I think the broader point that they were raising is absolutely correct. We live in a borough here in Newham where 40% of the population earns about £20,000 or less. The average person who's using City Airport earns about £114,000. Black people are disproportionately impacted by air pollution, over a rate of about 25%. 40,000 people die each year in this country unnecessarily from air pollution. So it's absolutely right that they connect that. But secondly, and much more importantly, and I think this was right by them, you know, we as a community, as a black community, have always been international in our outlook. And as a community, we recognise that when we say Black Lives Matter, they matter everywhere. And so they were right to say that the reality of climate change, when you look at its impacts in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, when you realise the kind of droughts, famines, and floods that are taking place, the displacement of people, these are not happening because it's natural. They're happening because of the overconsumption, the pollution by rich industrialized countries, primarily white. 50% of that emission are coming from just simply 10% of the world's population. They're right to point out that, and they're right to point out that airport expansion, which if you took as a country would be the seventh most polluting country in the world, and that this kind of airport expansion that we're seeing at City Airport and in other places is incompatible with the right to not only prevent the climate crisis, but to say that Black Lives Matter in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America. If you believe that those people have a right, and we have a right to decent life, then you can't allow airport expansion. So I think they were right on every point.
Thank you, Asad. Thank you very much. Doctor, you were saying earlier when you initially were pleased about it, but then there was a question of credibility. I mean, given what Lee Jasper has said and what Asad has said, do you think there's a question of credibility? Don't you think it was right that those 9 people did what they did?
I think it's only right. I take on board what Lee has said, and it's very much along the lines of my thinking. But I think it is only right, and it is going to be important to show that the agenda of the Black Lives Matter movement in the UK is driven by black people. That's not the thing that comes across when you see, you know, sort of predominantly white people doing that and calling it Black Lives Matter. But what Lee is saying, which is probably true, is that this was more of a tactical decision. Now, so long as that is a tactical decision, and so long as the agenda is still being driven by black people, then they would not succumb to a criticism of having a credibility gap. Because I think what what could happen is that the impression might be created that these are white people who are using the name black people to then sort of project their own agenda. I'm not saying that is the case, but I'm just saying they have to try to ensure that that doesn't happen.
Okay, Lee, can we come back to you and ask you, in terms of the awareness that black people themselves have between the connection of climate change and the black injustice, racial injustice, do you think there is an awareness amongst black people themselves about this injustice that's going on? Or was it, in a sense, brought to their attention by what happened on September the 6th outside or inside the city airport?
I think there's more work to do to raise awareness of the issues of climate change, its impact upon communities here in the UK and farther abroad. Just as a practical consequence, I mean, we all send remittances home, don't we, to support our families in our countries of origin. I've now replaced my parents' roof in Jamaica probably 7 or 8 times in the last 6 or 7 years because of the upsurge in hurricane season that has taken place. And that, of course, just a 1% rise in the warmth of the Caribbean Sea has produced a doubling in the intensity of the hurricane season. You can see that happening across Southern America, the south coast of America too. So we have a very real issue. The problem is that out there in communities, this issue is not well understood. And I think it behoves any campaigner that is campaigning in the name of black communities, is however right they may be in an objective sense to prioritise issues, that has to be accompanied with ensuring that the community is informed, supportive, educated and raise awareness so that they are supporting the actions that you are taking on their behalf. And the danger of not doing that is, of course, that your actions become misunderstood and open to caricature or misrepresentation. So I think that, there is an issue of saying, well, where is... I remember that, I always give the tale of standing in a queue at Sainsbury's or going into Tesco's in Brixton and walking past environmental campaigners who were this time saving whales. And virtually every black person in this Tesco was ignored as people went to, what they saw as white middle-class people to talk about their environmental concerns. The environmental issues were still very much seen in that way from large sections of the black communities here in Britain, and we've just got to do more to make sure that the case is made so that people understand what actions are being taken on their behalf, and we avoid the extent to which those things can be misunderstood.
Perhaps I can put that question, thank you for those comments, perhaps I can put that question to Asad, because of course you are the head of the International Climate Change Committee, the Friends of the Earth. What are you doing? What are the Friends of the Earth doing to get a realisation or more kind of awareness to the black communities about how climate change affects them?
Well, and I think it's an important point, and my background is as likely as an activist within our community on race murders, on policing violence and injustice. And I'm an internationalist. I recognise that my countries of diaspora, the diaspora communities here, but also our responsibility to our countries of origin. And that's why for many of us, we've led the struggles against apartheid, for Palestine and for justice around the world. And that's what drove me to actually be part of the environmental justice movement, because the environmental justice movement here in the UK, of course, has been predominantly seen as being a white kind of movement and a campaign. And I think there's a lot of work to be done. And so Friends of the Earth has been doing that, is trying to work directly with black communities here, but also stand in solidarity with communities globally. So very much both in terms of the solidarity work that we've done with Black Lives Matter, with Wretched of the Earth, with the Muslim Climate Action Group, with many, many different communities, but also with communities of origin. We stand in solidarity with, for example, the communities in sub-Saharan Africa, in Nigeria, who are fighting against Shell and the oil, dirty energy companies there, that not only are destroying people's environments and their lives, but of course are causing the climate pollution, which disproportionately affects us as a community. So we see it both as a local and global issue being connected. So it's right that, sometimes you need to take an action which raises an issue, but you also need to consolidate and build up from the ground. And I think both approaches need to be done together, and they they are, of course, complementary. So we need these kind of high-profile actions to begin the kind of national conversation we're having today. But also we need to do the long-term, real-rooted work, which means primarily looking first and foremost at what are the issues that affect the black community the most. And that, of course, are issues about air pollution. We die more and faster and lead the worst and live in the worst environmental conditions, that whether that's about our access to food or our air pollution or our homes, but also looking at them at a global level. And we try and do all of those things together.
Dr. Chigor, you're of course involved in race inequality in the Newham district, the Newham borough. In terms of your work and your involvement that may be alongside climate change, what's your interaction with the people who may be affected by that, and what kind of work are you doing to try and help out the situation?
Right. Well, the Rights and Equalities in Newham, which is what our organization is called, began life as Race Equalities in Newham. At a time when there were lots of race equalities organizations across the country. And so Newham was one of them. And whilst a lot of them have gone away, we are still there and still doing good work. I have to agree with a lot of what has been said. A lot of our work have not focused on climate change. A lot of our work has focused on looking out for young people, organizing activities for young people to come and do in the evenings, to sort of get away from the streets and do something constructive, advocating for minority ethnic people across Newham, either by sort of attending case hearings and so on, and things like that. And there is a sense in which we have tended to look at that, perhaps to, basically agreeing with the point that has been made, as being slightly more important than climate change. So in that sense, it is good that the connection between climate change and the life of black people, the fact that that connection is being highlighted is a good thing. I'm not promising that I'm going to go back and we're going to sort of start doing climate change things. So in that sense, I'm happy that there's a group doing it. But as has already been said, what would be good is that, well, we give them a chance to develop, but as they develop, that they ensure that they develop in a way that is transparently seen that it is driven by black people.
Indeed. And we've been carrying out a poll, if you like, to see the reaction of black people to this and whether, in fact, they tie the two between the two. And our poll is not a scientific poll, but certainly quite interesting, because we had 37% of the people that we interviewed, or who responded to us, said that they thought it was a climate change and racial issue. It was. And we had around about 39% who thought that it wasn't. So there's still a lot to do in terms of getting that kind of awareness.
There is, and that's because it's not always obvious at a local level that there is a connection. It isn't always obvious, so a lot of awareness raising needs to be done by us as well as everybody else. At global level in particular, the connection is much more obvious. And I think that those of us, or those people who are able to think globally, are more likely to see the connection than those who are simply looking locally.
Indeed. Asad, can I ask you your reaction to that? 37% of people said it is, and 39% said it was, and then the rest said, I don't know. So we got a pretty even split, in a sense.
Absolutely, and I think this is one of the huge challenges that we have. I think far too long, people have talked about climate change as being about, abstract things, about polar bears and icebergs, rather than actually talking about climate change as being directly impacting the lives of people, of being able to put forward real stories of people about the impacts that are happening in Asia and Africa and Latin America, to talk about how they impact on people's everyday existence, and also to talk about the better world that we can create, that the solutions can be better for us. Look, 1 in 3 people around the world don't even have access to energy or affordable energy. We have 700 million people who don't have access to fresh water. About 1.5 million don't have access to sanitation. There's deep, deep inequalities in the world, and we know that. We know that 80% of the world's population only own about 5% of the world's wealth, while the top 1% disproportionately own about 50%. So we know that these inequalities exist. The challenge is not only to talk about climate change as a problem, but also to talk about the solutions, the better solutions. So even at a local level, if we start talking about how we can have energy efficiency, that means insulation in people's homes. So we tackle the energy poverty that so many of our communities live under. But it means they've got warmer homes, they've got lower bills. That's a plus, but it also creates new jobs for young people,
Indeed.
new jobs for our local economies. So I think we need to talk about climate change in a very, very different way.
Indeed.
We need to talk about it less as an environmental issue and much more as a social justice issue. That's what Friends of the Earth is committed to do. And that's why we work directly with Black communities, stand in solidarity. And we, of course, very much shaped by the narrative and the framing of it is both here and globally.
Asad, Rehman, thank you very much indeed for the reports. We have run out of time. Dr. Chigor, Chike, thank you for, and of course to Lee Jasper, who also was part of the conversation. We've come to the end of the programme now. Thank you to all my guests, and thank you to you at home for watching. Catch us up online on the Africa on IC, and you can use the hashtag for sending stories and comments to Africa This Week IC. Do check out our past episodes as well on www.islamchannel.tv if you've missed any of those. Right. Once the pride of Africa, the dance scene, Guinea's ballet troupe has seen its stars fall and fade away. Aging acrobats and singers are now having to train a new generation to face the very uncertain future. The group was created in the early 1950s when a newly independent Guinea began investing heavily in culture. But the lack of funding has chipped away at the pride and the reputation of the dancers. We leave you with scenes of their performance. Until next week, goodbye.